Just over 10 years ago, CNAS pulled together its first collection of essays on grand strategy. We collected some of the biggest thinkers, one might say some of the usual suspects, in the United States grand strategy world to ask them, what is their best case for America's grand strategy in the early 21st century? 4 years later, undeterred from having asked that question once and gotten back some good answers, we asked a similar group a similar question. Today, the debate over America's proper role in the world is perhaps wider than at any time in decades. The 2016 presidential election illuminated some deep divides in the American public about the scope of the country's interests, the nature of existing threats, the financial and military burdens on the United States and how they should shoulder them, and the methods for attaining national objectives, however you want to define them. In the last few years, among my peers, who have been raised on American indispensability, long word, and exceptionalism, there was a growing sense of not only errors in execution of American grand strategy, but possible flaws in the vision. Maybe flaws, maybe questionable definitions, maybe we're not really sure what we're doing. And it became okay to talk about these questions, not in just a dark corner of the Cato Institute, as one of the essays says, but also in a lot of places, like a mainstream think tank event at the Newseum, or a happy hour where they serve $8 PBR. People started to talk about what is American grand strategy as though it was a cool topic to discuss, which is kind of amazing, but also something to celebrate. So to harness this willingness to question, CNAS decided last year to commission yet another series of essays, we wanted to try again, with a new generation of grand strategists. We told them to assess how ongoing changes in the world would reshape American strategy, to propose actual recommendations and alternatives on how you might actually implement this, and to do so in a way that was approachable and understandable to folks who love grand strategy, but also to people who don't talk about it on a day-to-day basis. And I think we succeeded, as you'll see in the volume that we released today, but also I hope you'll see in the debate that we have this morning. This is the second year that CNAS has hosted the Michael J. Zak Grand Strategy Lecture, inspired and very usefully prodded by a good friend and board member at CNAS here. Mike has pressed us to do a lot more original thinking on grand strategy over the last several years, and I think we have tried to live up to that in these events, but also in these essays. And Mike, I wanted to ask if you want to say a couple words on this.
Thank you, Lauren. It's been a privilege to be a member of the board at CNAS for what's now 10 or 11 years, and I'm really pleased to have my name associated with this discussion of grand strategy. I see some seasoned faces in the audience, and I'm going to guess that there are many stories among you about strategy, so I thought I'd share one of mine. Some time ago, I was working in a multinational high technology corporation in a division that was composed of 4 product lines where I managed one of the product lines. And one day I received a memo in my inbox. This was back in the days when we actually had inboxes. And the memo said that our group vice president, who was the guy that my boss reported to, had requested a strategy review of the division's business. And this group executive vice president was a street smart, savvy guy, and he wanted us all to update him. So we went off and did all the stuff you do. We had the workshops and the offsites, and we created 3-ring binders, and I'm sure that none of you have ever had to do that. So we did all that stuff, and on the day of the review, we all filed into one of those fancy wood-paneled rooms that I've generally in my career tried to stay out of. And we started giving our presentations. And from the minute we started talking, it was clear that it wasn't going well, that the brilliance that we thought we were about to impart just wasn't turning out the way we thought it would. One of the most prominent indicators of how the meeting was going was that the group exec would ask these short, simple questions, and we would go back at him with these long, complicated answers. And those of you who give briefings know that that's the wrong way to do it. It's supposed to be the other way around. The person being briefed asks those long, complicated questions, and you, the briefer, respond with short, simple, easy to understand. So the symmetry was wrong here. So finally, it was going so poorly that our boss, the division president, turns to the group exec and he says, okay, it's pretty clear that this is not going well. So let's back up. I have a very basic question for you. Could you give us your definition of a strategy? So the group exec, I can envision him as I speak. He looks up at the ceiling and he looks around at us and he comes back, he brings his eyes back down to the rest of us and he looks around the room and he says, well, you know what? I guess I can't tell you what a strategy is, but I can tell you what one isn't. And what you've been telling me today isn't a strategy. Now I know how he felt, because when it comes to national security, I don't really know what a grand strategy is either, but I know what one isn't. And I'm convinced that as a nation, whatever it is we're doing these days, it's not based on grand strategy. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that we're fortunate here this morning to have a number of guests with us who do know what a grand strategy is. And it's my fervent hope that discussions like this amongst new thinkers and new voices like that will lead the nation closer to a grand strategy that makes sense and which can be the basis for making good decisions that leave us all safer and more secure.
So for our grand strategy extravaganza today, we're going to have two panels followed by a live podcast that you're welcome to stick around with Ryan Evans, the host of the War on the Rocks podcast. Our first panel will be moderated by Elbridge Colby, the Program Director for Defense at the Center for New American Security. His panelists will be Emma Ashford, a Research Fellow in Defense and Foreign Policy at Cato, Hal Brands, the Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins, and Kizer, the Policy Director at Win Without War, to discuss not your grandparents' grand strategy, making the shift from how to why. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lauren, and thanks to Mike Zak for his leadership on this really important issue. Although I will say, Lauren referred to some of us as grand strategists, which reminds me a little bit of when you see somebody referred to as a political strategist on TV, that you better also have a day job that that has a regular salary. So just a little thought there. But very exciting group with I think very different views, which should spark a great conversation. So I'll ask a couple of questions and have a discussion up here, and then we'll turn to Cry's comments from the wilderness questions. Keep your arrows metaphorical, please. But I think Lauren introduced our group. I think the way I'd like to actually start out the conversation, and it betrays my own views a little bit, but I think is a useful starting point. And I want to start by asking Hal and Emma, what is the world distribution of power going to look like? What is it like today? What is it going to look like? And then on that basis, what is it that America needs to do? What is its standard for success that will enable whatever goods you want to trot out as our aspiration? If you could kind of give us a sense, sort of briefly, what we're aiming for, and then I'm going to turn and ask Kate for some comments on this. But Emma, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so I think at its most basic level, the problem is we don't know what the world distribution of power is going to look like in the coming decades, right? We can make guesses, and I think the most likely guesses are that we're going to be heading for some form of multipolar world. Whether that multipolarity is global, in that there are a sort of a bunch of states that are of equivalent power in different regions, or whether that multipolarity is perhaps the US still remains the predominant global power, but within different regions there's a form of multipolarity. It could go either way, but both of those seem pretty likely. The point is, however, that we can't really be sure that's where we're headed. And so the trick, I think, is to try and find a strategy that allows us to hedge against that. So even though I think it's very unlikely that we're headed for some sort of bipolar Cold War style situation with China, we can't dismiss that possibility. And we also can't dismiss the possibility of sort of other challengers, other countries coming from other places.
Can I ask you, how would your strategy, your preferred strategy, and maybe you can kind of briefly outline it for the group, and they'll be able to look at your paper, but how would your strategy change, say, if China becomes more and more powerful versus if we have a much more sort of diffused power world? Is your strategy constant, or is it going to adapt?
I prefer to think of it as it allows us flexibility in the future. It sets us up so that when we finally see what is actually coming, we can deal with it pretty well. And so in my essay, I basically outline a strategy that is effectively offshore balancing. So I took Lauren's injunction to heart, and I tried not to use any of the big grand strategy words in my piece. But if you're interested, read my piece and then read Jason Castillo's piece in the volume as well, because he basically makes the same argument I do, but he uses all the big sort of grand strategy justifications from the literature. And so I think they go together pretty well. But the basic idea is a strategy that allows the US to conserve its power, keep a somewhat predominant role, without getting too bogged down in the affairs of other countries in other regions. And I think, as Jason points out, that would look different in different places. So in my essay, I talk about, in the Middle East, there's really no need for a US presence at all, because there's really no risk that another hegemon or great power is going to arise there. In Asia, because there is this prospect that China will rise, whether it's to multipolarity or bipolarity, keeping the flexibility to deal with that down the road if we need to is important. It's the same in Europe, where the US currently, our posture is massively overextended for the threats that we actually face. We do need to keep the possibility of going in as a sort of a balancer of last resort, even though it's incredibly unlikely.
So, Hal, I think if I could characterize, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in some ways you're less sanguine, and in some ways maybe more sanguine. You're less sanguine about the future and the potential for threats or the actual threats, but you're more sanguine about the future of American power. I think, and Emma, you say this explicitly in your piece, that we are, as you said, we're overextended, we're taxing ourselves too much. That's the downside of our overengaged foreign policy. Hal, could you kind of lay out your perspective on this and maybe just kind of briefly talk through the broad outlines of your argument?
Sure. I mean, I think there actually is some overlap between the way we would see a region like the Middle East, for instance. And so I would generally agree with the proposition that the United States has been overinvested in the greater Middle East for a number of years, although we probably differ on sort of precisely how far you can come down in that region at an acceptable level of risk. With respect to the broader questions, I mean, the world it's clearly not multipolar in the sense that you have, three or more players that are roughly evenly balanced across the various attributes of power. It's not bipolar, at least not yet. The United States still has significant accumulated leads over China in the military domain and in a variety of other domains. But it's clearly less unipolar than it was in 1994 or 2002, to the point where I think you can ask the question whether the term unipolar accurately describes the international system today. And so what I think the goal of American grand strategy should be is in some ways it's a retreat from what we thought we might get in the headiest days of the post-Cold War world, where I think the assumption, or at least what the publicly stated premise rather, was that we could ultimately work toward an increasingly globalized liberal international order in which countries like Russia and China would eventually be integrated as responsible stakeholders, or whatever the term of art might have been. We're not going to get there anytime soon, in part because of the shifting power dynamics, in part because these countries are now increasingly challenging that system. But I think our goal, and I think it's a reasonable goal, should be to try to hold the line as best we can, to preserve as close as we can to the existing balance of power and an array of forces in key regions like Europe or in the Asia Pacific, to try to make sure that the global prevalence of democracy is not significantly rolled back in the way that it sometimes seems to be in danger of being rolled back today. And so I think of this sort of as a grand strategy of preservation, where we're basically trying to preserve as much good stuff as we can in a more difficult environment. And I'm happy to say more about this. And I think we do have the power to do that, particularly if we can continue to act in the coalition manner that the United States has long acted.
So what, and maybe, I mean, because my sense is that some of the arguments that you cite, like Brooks and Woolforth and Beckley, I mean, they have points I agree with, but that my own take would be that there's, especially Beckley's stuff, it's very optimistic. I mean, I think America has a lot of promise in our internal resources, but what if particularly the growth of China is much more significant in a relative basis than people like Beckley anticipate? What is really markedly different? What is different from what you're saying from, say, what the late Clinton administration was saying, or the Bush administration, say, in 2006 or 2007? What won't we do, or what fundamental significant changes would mark that break?
So I'm fundamentally,
if any.
yeah,
Sure.
I'm fundamentally more pessimistic about the idea that, I mean, just to put it bluntly, that a country like China will be tamed in the way that we thought China would be tamed in the 1990s and through the 2000s. And I think that the governing thesis there was that the more integrated China became into the international system, the wealthier it became, the more politically liberal it would become, and the less incentive it would have to disrupt things over time. Now, it could be that this is just one of these bets that hasn't paid off yet, but it's not going to pay off anytime soon. And so we can no longer plan on that basis. And so some of the things that I say we should do differently would have to do, so I'll just give you an example. For about 20 years after the Cold War, 25 years after the Cold War, this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but we basically pursued ever deeper economic integration with China. And my take is that it's hard to compete effectively with China if that is your premise. And that's true with respect to certain sort of niche areas of dependence in particular. And so the anecdote or the stat I always like to give here is if you look at the report on the defense industrial base that the administration put out in the second half of last year, buried on about page 27 of that report is a sentence that says that most of the munitions that the United States buys include some components that are sourced from China or from other countries with which we do not have particularly friendly relations today. That's clearly an area in which interdependence has created vulnerabilities for the United States. And so while I don't want to see sort of an overarching economic decoupling, I think there are particular areas in which we've developed competitive vulnerabilities.
Just last question on this line, why don't you want to see a decoupling? If China is an authoritarian system that's on the march, that's increasingly powerful, isn't Aaron Friedberg maybe right that we need to pursue decoupling and ultimately not a win-win perspective?
So I don't think about it as a win-win perspective. I just think that if you're going for a thoroughgoing decoupling, it makes it almost impossible to get domestic consensus in the United States. It makes it incredibly difficult to get consensus among our friends and allies, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, but not just there. And also, it removes what I think of as the biggest shock absorber in the relationship. This is going to be a very tense relationship for a number of years. And we need things that will give leaders pause when the crisis comes. And I think economic interdependence, even though it constrains us in certain respects, it certainly constrains the Chinese as well.
Okay, great, thanks. Kate, so your argument is that a lot of this style of discussion, this whole framework, is misconceived, and in fact, I would say kind of it has sort of deleterious consequence because it puts people in the wrong mindset. Could you kind of explain why this way of thinking has led us into this unfortunate place, and what kind of briefly discuss what your recommendation for how we should do things differently?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this type of discussion gets to very quickly a militarized mindset about the world. And this focus on power dynamics and competition, while I think has some importance, often leads us to be distracted from other challenges that have non-military solutions. And I think with a challenge like China, there's a current trend right now where people are kind of jumping to a lot of conclusions about what China's rise means. Are they a revisionist power? Yes, they are. They want to totally dismantle the system. And I don't necessarily think that's true. And I think what that jumping to conclusion does is it actually limits our options in the future, and will ultimately end up creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where we end up militarizing the relationship, kind of avoiding any type of cooperation with seeming adversaries. And I think that's actually to our own detriment. And so in my paper, I argue that we need really a radical transformation of how the United States engages with the world that also relies on a transformation of how we engage here at home. And so rather than applying a grand strategy kind of in an overarching way that applies to all contexts, I just don't think that really could exist in a multipolar, multi-causal world. And so what we need to do is actually define a set of principles that help define U.S. interests in specific situations. And really, those should come from our values. This country was founded on very aspirational values that we by no means have fulfilled, whether here at home or abroad. But they all interplay with one another. And the 5 principles that I propose are safety, solidarity, self-determination, justice, and equality. And the interesting thing about this approach is that they all kind of self-reinforce each other. So if we are redefining what security means, not only for Americans, but also how we build security abroad, it leads to a different set of policy solutions and tools that are emphasized in the process.
So I think, thank you, that really captures it very, very, very well. My question, though, is you're talking about emphasizing our values and, or, kind of your conception of our values. Obviously, people have different views, but I think you would acknowledge that, for instance, the Chinese government has a different conception of what the ideal values for the people of China and beyond are, or the Russian government, or the Iranian government, whatever you think about them strategically. How do you deal with the problem that we are dealing with other countries that have quite different conceptions of their values and may not be willing to cooperate and may be taking military actions on their own? How do you address that problem in your strategy?
So I think it's more of a matter of recognizing that, yes, these governments have different value sets, different interests, but really thinking about, does that actually reflect the will of their people? And I think, universally, most people want to be safe. They want to have the freedom of choice. They want to be able to determine their own leaders. And I think that's why, the international system, as much as it has crumbled under this administration in particular, still has some value. But I also think that system and why powers like Russia and China have been able to challenge it is because it has inherent weaknesses, that it doesn't have the mechanisms necessary to actually align the leaders of that system's interests with the interests of the people themselves. And so one issue is accountability, where the United States has actively avoided accountability for itself, used accountability to punish adversaries, whereas its quote-unquote allies, it has kind of shielded them from accountability on the international stage, and also, prevented the international system from being able to achieve accountability for mass atrocities and various things. And so I think if we change our approach in terms of how we actually hold ourselves to our own value standards, it actually allows us to make a more credible case when we are actually aligning our interests with the interests of the people in these countries. And one example is the Arab Spring, where the Obama administration had a lot of great rhetoric about standing up for human rights and democracy in Egypt, for example, but as soon as push came to shove, it did not support the aspirations of the activists in the street. It backed a military coup and refused to call it a coup so it could continue military assistance. And so I would say that in those types of situations, we need a different approach. When situations like that happen, we need to actually use our leverage in these countries to affect positive change. We need to expand our diplomatic engagement to actually understand what the aspirations are of these people, to ensure that our foreign policy first does no harm in addition to lifting people up.
Great. So I'm going to turn to the crowd in about 2 minutes before. So please think of your questions, and I'll take you just when you raise your hand. But briefly, please try to be concise on this because we only have a few more minutes. But do you guys think that the concept of the liberal international order or the rules-based international order is a useful and accurate one, or should we junk it? Let me start with you, Kate.
So I think it's a useful framework, but only if we actually act like we are constrained by the rules that we want to constrain others through. I think that over the years, we have seen time and again, we use these rules as a cudgel to other countries that we don't think their actions are in our interest. But as soon as push comes to shove and, we, for example, are being investigated for war crimes committed in Afghanistan, we immediately throw the rule book out and we take action that actually inhibits any type of accountability for ourselves. And so I think it's useful in terms of it actually provides a framework to fulfill the aspirations of the majority of people in the world, but only if the leader of that system actually follows the rules of that system and does all it can to improve those rules and improve the mechanisms to enforce those rules across the board.
So analytically, yes, I think it is valuable, and I don't agree with the critique that the liberal international order is neither liberal nor international nor an order, which you sometimes hear. politically, not so much, right? And I just don't think the term means anything to anyone who's not showing up at the Newseum at 9 on a Friday to hear this sort of debate. And so I think the challenge for American policymakers, this is not a new challenge. It goes back, I think, to the end of the Cold War, is to figure out how we talk about the things that the United States does in the world, which I view to mostly be good and necessary, in a language that actually connects with voters.
Can you just briefly describe what you understand it to mean analytically?
So analytically, I just think of it as referring to an international system where liberal, sort of small L liberal, democratic systems are geopolitically dominant, where democracy is prevalent and human rights are fairly broadly respected, where liberal sort of approaches to trade tend to hold sway. And the one that we particularly talked about, I mean, the particular order we're talking about is one in which the United States is the leading power. And I think of those as being sort of the critical components of it.
Emma?
Yeah, so there's obviously this big debate about the liberal international order, but I think there is a related but perhaps even more important debate, which is the idea that some people say America has had the same grand strategy since the end of World War II, and it's creating a liberal international order and saving the world from tyranny. If you look at our grand strategy since the end of the Cold War, it's been the same in means, right? We're still setting up alliances, we're still trying to spread democracy, we're working with other countries, but it has been vastly expanded in motives, right? The ends that we're trying to achieve with the same grand strategy have grown from sort of containment and fighting the Soviet Union to now we have George W. Bush saying, well, our goal is nothing less than ending tyranny all across the world. And so if there is a liberal international order, or if this is just American strategy, it has morphed in the last 25 years from something that was relatively focused on perhaps preservation is in fact the right word, to something that was much more assertive, aggressive, and revisionist. And that is the problem. So that's when we talk about a strategy of preserving the gains of the liberal international order today. That's what I worry about. We're not talking about preserving the Cold War approach to grand strategy. We're talking about preserving something that doesn't really have any limits on what America is actually trying to achieve overseas. We're talking about something that is so ambitious. Even policymakers here in DC, I think, would have trouble defining exactly what it is we're trying to achieve.
So this is, before I turn to the crowd, this is always my question for the restraint advocates is, are you talking about going back to the Cold War basic approach, which kind of be my broad view, which is basically, maybe, Hal and I wouldn't agree on everything, but, kind of, let's go back to a more status quo, but quite engaged approach and not do stupid things so much? Or are you really talking about something more fundamental, like a kind of a come home America, sort of maybe, people like Christopher Lane, where the question I ask you reading your approach is, sometimes it sounds like don't do sort of dumb things and like make smarter decisions on the margin, or are you saying, you're not saying dump NATO. So when a policymaker reads your paper, are you saying something, we need to have a fundamental change, or we need to go back to where we were, say, in 1980?
So I think this is something interesting, right? On the sort of the liberal international order proponents' side, nobody expects everybody to agree on everything, but when they talk about restraint, they treat it as this sort of, hegemonic community that we all agree. We don't all agree on everything. So there are people that range from sort of retrenching a little bit all the way to come home America, right? What I talk about in my paper is somewhere in the middle between those two options. You're right, I'm not saying dump NATO, but I am saying reduce, or in fact remove the US military presence in Europe, make it so that America is in effect the balancer of last resort in Europe, and make it so that basically our European allies carry all the burden there. We're not talking about abandoning the world entirely. That's why restraint isn't isolationism. But we are talking about dialing down our commitments where it makes sense in order to focus on the issues that are more important to us.
There is, I believe, somebody who works and lives near here who I think has a very similar view. I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, questions from the audience. Sir, in the back there.
Hi, thank you. Jacob Marks, Open Society Foundations. This is a question for Hal. The premise of this question is that the greatest threat to the world is climate change, and the greatest threat to democracy is large tech companies. And in your statement, you suggested that U.S. ability to project force in different places around the world is an important factor in being able to deal with the issues that we all face. Do you have any thoughts about how that helps deal with those particular challenges?
Well, so I wouldn't suggest that the ability to project military force is critical to addressing climate change or dealing with large tech companies. But I guess the way I would frame this is I think that, and I would fully acknowledge that one of the big tensions in the strategy that I would want to pursue is how do you reconcile how do you reconcile dealing with two what I see as major threats to the well-being of the world that we've created in the United States? On the one hand, the threat of sort of major power, authoritarian revisionism. On the other hand, the threat that climate change will have the impacts that are increasingly predicted that it will have. My take on this is that we sometimes get hung up in saying you can do one or the other, right? You can either contain Chinese influence when it's expressed in malign ways, or you can cooperate with the Chinese on climate change. I actually think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. If you look back at past great power competitions, including past competitions the United States has been involved in, there have been a variety of instances in which we have competed fiercely with a rival and yet managed to preserve sort of compartmentalized cooperation in areas where we had common interests. That's the case when the United States and the United Kingdom sort of tacitly cooperate to enforce the Monroe Doctrine during the 19th century. It's the case during the Cold War, which was, I think, is in some ways the most intense long-term rivalry most of us can think of, and yet there was superpower cooperation to eradicate smallpox, there was superpower cooperation to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, and of course, there was superpower cooperation to limit the danger of nuclear war. And so my view is that you can do both of these things at once, assuming that both sides do indeed have an interest in addressing the threat of climate change, to take an example.
Thank you, by the way, for having a very concise and direct question, sir. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is primarily for Hal, but I'd appreciate hearing the ideas of the others on the stage as well. With respect to your comment about the threat to U.S. security posed by integration with China with respect to munitions, I'm appreciative of the vulnerability created by that integration. But when it comes to decoupling certain economic interests that we have with China, how can we do that while also mitigating the risk of seeming hostile or increasing tensions?
And can you just identify yourself?
Andrew Dillon.
Okay.
So I was at a gathering of U.S. and Chinese observers a couple of weeks ago, in which one of the observers from the Chinese side basically said, it's really interesting that the United States, are now identifying China as your primary adversary. We've identified you as the primary adversary for 30 years. We just don't say it publicly. And so this is, I say that just in the sense that I'm not actually that worried about China perceiving us to be hostile to them if we start to try to make our defense supply chain more resilient. Because I think, and again, this is where I'm pretty pessimistic, I think that hostility is already perceived. I think that steps like this are basically expected at this point. And so whatever margin of ill will you get by doing this, I think is relatively minor compared to the competitive gain you get from giving yourself a little bit more resilience in this area.
Actually, I think this provides me a great opportunity to highlight the title of this panel, which I really loved. It's called Not Your Grandfather's Grand Strategy. And you said, do restrainers want to go back to the Cold War? Is that what you want? The argument that I make in my paper is that, no, we don't want to go back to the Cold War because that's not the point. Everybody's debating China, and they're debating it in frame of, should we go back? Should we adopt containment? Should we adopt rollback? We're talking about applying these old strategies to a situation that is frankly quite different. The rise of China isn't the same. And this is one area where actually I think I agree with Hal almost entirely, which is that interdependence helps to actually prevent conflict. That's a vulnerability that we have. It's a vulnerability the Chinese have. That's interdependence, right? But it's also a help to us that we didn't have during the Cold War because we simply didn't have that kind of trade between the Soviet Union and the US. So in some ways, we need a new strategy, right? But we're also in a slightly better situation than we used to be.
Just to be clear, I wasn't demeaning the Cold War strategy. I think our grandparents' grand strategy was pretty fantastic. But did you have comments?
Yes, I don't agree with that last.
I'm sure you don't.
But
Good. Say so, please.
I mean, just on this issue of interdependence, what I think is really interesting about the debate in China, it becomes very quickly about, how do we make our defense supply chain more efficient? How do we, mitigate what they're doing in the South China Sea? And I think the interdependence issue is actually really vital to the solution to the challenge that China poses, because it goes back to this original question about climate change and the influence of tech companies. Because really, the issue of corruption and climate are actually quite intertwined, in that the corruption on the multinational scale, as well as here at home, actually prevents investment in the solutions needed to address climate change, not only in the United States, but also abroad. And the Chinese actually have a domestic political interest in addressing the effects of climate change because their people are actively feeling the effects of climate change today. And so not only does that present an opportunity for cooperation, but it also presents an opportunity for us to, quote unquote, economically compete while building economic security here at home. And if you talk to Americans, and I work for a national grassroots organization, their main issue with China, and Pew polling also indicates this, is that there is a fear of economic insecurity created by the rise of China. It's not a military fear. There's not a fear of that, China's going to invade San Francisco, for example. It's about how am I going to have strong middle-class jobs that give me social mobility in the face of jobs being shipped overseas, of multinational corporations acting in their own interest, not in the interest of the worker. And so I think there are clear solutions from that, whether that's investing in renewable energy and sustainable development here and around the world, advocating for a alternative to the Chinese Belt and Roads initiative through development finance, for example, that doesn't create a debt trap that the Chinese initiative does or the IMF institution does. And so I think it's an interesting conversation because it automatically becomes about military, but really the solutions here are investment here at home and thinking about how we do that differently abroad.
Ma'am.
Hi, my name is Emma Bates. I'm from CSIS. And your response dovetails perfectly into my question, which is for you, which is that what is the orienting objective of your grand strategy? Is it to follow our objectives? I mean, is it to follow our values? Does it have to do with polarity and, which country sets the rules of the road? And what is the response of your strategy to the potential contingency that we end up in an existential great power conflict that ends up deciding who gets to set their values as the example for the world?
Thanks for the question. I think I love the three-parter question, so I'll try to answer all the questions. I think that the organizing principles of my strategy is not that we follow our values, because I think in the past that's led to massive amounts of military intervention around the world to secure values. It's more about having a set of principles that when we come upon a situation or a current context, we think about the effect of our policies on other people. It's really about elevating the impacts of our policies on people around the world that actually will make the United States a credible actor for change and actual positive change in the world, which we haven't really seen. And so it's not that we're going to go around and do democracy promotion, I think, as traditionally has been seen, or at the barrel of a gun. But really, it's about how do we build safety and security for other people around the world? What are the tools that we need to apply in the long term to actually allow others to lift themselves up, to have economic development, to determine their own futures? How do we empower other people on the local level to ensure that their human needs are met? And how do we achieve those human needs at home? And so it's much more of an organizing principle for domestic policy as well as international policy. And I think that's really kind of the essential aspect of this strategy, is that it's getting rid of the divide between domestic and foreign policy. In such an interconnected world, I think that we have to recognize that it's not just about power relations. It's how are we actually setting an example here at home to make change abroad. Because, for example, with anti-money laundering practices, it was actually U.S. laws that set the international standard. And so the beneficial ownership is a great example of this that would undermine the foreign influence of money here at home. And it's doing things like that that I think would mitigate this great power bipolar competition, and also uplift the idea that the majority of the people around the world want the same thing, but we could actually be a facilitator of that change, which I think actually would deplete these types of competitions that we're seeing and point to the right solution.
I think that's a great question, because put it another way, if I could, that's basically saying what happens if you're wrong. And I think we talked about that a little bit, but it's, I won't go into it here, but I think whenever somebody's thinking about a strategy, one of the key questions is, what if your assessment of the future is wrong? How does your strategy sort of fail, or if it's the wrong fit? Do you have an idea for how to do that that's consistent with the logic of what you're doing? So, ma'am.
Catherine Elgin, Princeton University. I think one of the interesting aspects of the moment we have now is that we're not only facing a rising power, but also a declining power that's not likely to go down quietly, Russia. And we haven't mentioned it today, so I'm curious how you see Russia as fitting into your strategy, in particular when, if it's not going to go down quietly, it could really impact some of our strongest allies in Europe. Thank you.
Great. Why don't we start with you, Emma, and let's kind of briefly go through here.
Sure. So, I mean, I think there are possibilities with regard to Russia that we haven't really considered. You're right. They're not going down quietly. They are basically determined to act as a spoiler in every conflict. I think the question is the extent to which U.S. policy provides Russia an opening to act as a spoiler. So we talk about their intervention in Syria, and that was bad for U.S. interests. It's not actually clear to me why the Russian intervention was bad for U.S. interests in Syria. It was certainly bad for the people of Syria. It was a horrifying human rights catastrophe, but it didn't actually really impact U.S. policy there. Some Russian actions, certainly like the election sort of interference, those directly impact U.S. interests. But a lot of what Russia's doing around the world is mostly just trying to make themselves appear relevant, create a domestic narrative that serves to shore up the regime in the Kremlin. And that offers the possibility that there are sort of other ways that could be achieved, right? So there are ways that we could work with Russia. And, as much as I hate to sort of agree with anything that Steve Bannon or Mike Flynn ever said, they did have sort of a kind of a point when they said that what we are doing right now in foreign policy is we are driving Russia closer and closer towards China. That doesn't necessarily need to be the case. There are ways in which we could learn to live in a more comfortable arrangement with Russia where we're not always pushing back on them, they're not always pushing back on us, that would also serve to sort of reduce Russia's incentives to move towards China.
So I love the premise of your question, and I think it gets it exactly right. And where it really starts to manifest is in the question of risk tolerance. And so one of the reasons I think that the Russian government has so far proven far more risk tolerant than the Chinese government is that the Chinese government still looks out and sees the future as being relatively bright, particularly when they see all the trouble that the democratic world is having. The Russian government, to the extent that it looks 10 to 15 years down the road, probably can't be particularly pleased by what it sees. And so I think that creates a temptation to act more boldly in the near term, to try to lock in what you can. Unfortunately, I also think that makes it harder to do kind of the reverse Nixon goes to China sort of thing that we often talk about today. And I fully agree in sort of in a theoretical sense, you don't want to be the one part of the strategic triangle that everybody is cooperating against. But the challenge is sort of, can you get from where you are now to where you would like to be without paying too high of a cost? And I'm pessimistic about that for a couple of reasons. One is precisely that Russia is the more aggressive and risk-tolerant actor right now, even if China poses the more significant threat over the long and probably now even the medium term than the Russians do. Second, I agree that sort of opposition to the United States is a political tool for the Putin government. But I think where we probably differ is I think it's more immutable in the sense that I have a hard time seeing how that government can sustain itself without foreign enemies, of which the United States figures prominently. And so as a result of all this, I just think that if you actually sort of get down to brass tacks and say, what would we need to do to sort of bring the Russians on side in dealing with the threat of a hegemonic China, it's hard to figure out what you could do right now. That could change 10 to 15 years from now, by the way. And so if sort of from our perspective, the most pessimistic predictions about Chinese growth rates and Chinese power are borne out, I think that's going to make the Russians every bit as uncomfortable as it makes us. And so maybe the Russian calculus will change as their own situation changes, but I still think that's a number of years in the future at this point.
And my response would be, it's aligned with Emma, I think. It's looking at what are our interests vis-a-vis Russia, actually defining them, which I don't think has really been done recently, at least. And then think about ways that we can, A, cooperate with them, and then B, mitigate their ability to spoil. I absolutely believe that is in the United States' interest to cooperate with Russia on climate, on nuclear disarmament, as has been for the last 30 years. But in terms of like election interference, they're pumping of foreign money into our political system, into our business system. I think the solution is absolutely not military. It's looking at ways that we can end the influence of secret money in our election systems in the business world, and the ability of investors to hide behind shell companies. And on the international stage, it's thinking about how can we reform the UN Security Council to actually allow for accountability and active decision-making. So, for example, reforming the Security Council veto to not allow it to be used when atrocities are ongoing. Because theoretically, that's in everyone's interest to stop atrocities. And that would require holding the United States accountable and allowing these decisions to go through when we are the bad actor, but it will also allow us to hold Russia accountable when they are the bad actor. It's also expanding the membership of the Security Council to reflect the reality of a multipolar world and also dilute the influence of the permanent members, which can be beneficial if done in the right way.
Ma'am?
Hi, my name is Frances Klimzak. I'm actually a student at the Naval War College right now, going through the strategy and war course, so this is very relevant. Emma, you talked a few minutes ago about shifting end states, and I'm just curious from everybody's perspective, how do we define an end state from which we can all define, how do we define an end state from which we can create a grand strategy that everybody agrees on? And I know that's a very general, broad question, but one of the things I take away from this discussion is that we certainly can't have shifting end states constantly in every area of the world. So how do we, as a nation, what are the biggest barriers to defining that value set, like Kate talks about, or that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the absolute worst part of writing my dissertation back when I was in grad school was the 2 weeks that my advisor made me try to define the national interest. Go read a bunch of stuff and define the national interest. So nobody agrees on this, right? And that's sort of the problem. The reason you're getting different answers from all three of us in this volume is that we are defining national interests differently. And I don't think we're ever going to find a national interest on which everyone agrees. But I think we need to have a debate, and my argument is that national interests today have been defined simply just far too broadly. When everything is in the national interest, it's hard to actually say what we're trying to do. And so, I mean, simply by moving forward and defining national interests, scoping them a lot more narrowly, for myself, I would argue that sort of territorial integrity, national security of the homeland is probably the most important thing, followed by making sure that no other country sort of rises to challenge the US, and then making sure that sort of US business interests and our ability to freely trade around the world continues. That's a pretty broad set of national interests. It's still so much narrower than how we define it today. And so at the very least, we're never going to all agree on this, but I think we can't have a debate unless we all explicitly define what it is we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah. So I would agree with most of that, I think, and I would say that you do occasionally. So one area, I guess the way I'll put it is one area, and there are areas in which there are fundamental disagreements over what the United States should be trying to achieve. And so I think, you can identify a couple of these. So one, does it matter for the United States how broadly represented democracy is as a form of government around the world, or does that not matter for us, right? That's a pivot point in the debate. But I actually think, at least sort of in what I would classify as kind of the traditional grand strategy debate, the debates are not so much about what we're trying to achieve, but what's the best way of doing it. And so I don't want to put words in Emma's mouth, but I think that Emma would probably say the balance of power in the Western Pacific does matter to the United States. The question is just, can we sustain that balance of power at a lower level of direct American engagement than we've become used to? Or I assume you would say that the balance of power in Europe does matter to the United States. How do we get it?
And actually I do think this is a point that we probably do need to make. So you can still scope the national interest more narrowly or define it however you want, but to some extent your risk tolerance and how you're willing to expend U.S. resources to get there is also going to shape the strategy that you get. So it isn't just the end state that impacts the result you get, which I think is what you're trying to say.
You're right. And so we're all against mass casualty terrorist attacks on the homeland, right? The disagreement is, do those become more or less likely if you stop droning folks, right? The debate becomes ultimately as much about sort of ways and means as much as it is about ends.
I mean, that's true, except, I think I agree with you certainly in this between you two, but there are conceptions of our interests that are much broader, that our democracy can't be safe. I think, Kate, if I understand you correctly, your view is that we're not ultimately safe and secure unless the world population is more safe and secure. Am I right? Now, you don't believe in using the military instrument in a way that some of the more assertive neoconservatives of the 2000s might have put it, but in a sense, President Bush in 2004 was saying, or 2005, if we don't end tyranny everywhere, it's not going to be safe here. So it was kind of a more militarized sort of, realist means, to Hal's point, of achieving, I think, the ends that you also are perceiving. Let me, there are a couple more questions. So, sir, there.
Good morning. My name is Yazdanyar. As far as the title, incoming student at the LBJ school this fall. So my question is for Kate, and it builds on a question that was asked a few minutes ago. So I wholly agree with your idea that the U.S. needs a radical new approach to foreign policy, and I really like the notion of marrying domestic and foreign policy. However, I feel like we're increasingly slipping into a more post-truth society. When you have people like Elliot Abrams being still around as though Iran-Contra never happened, right? So my question is, the implementation of your strategy, how does that look when people no longer care about, the facts and what policy says, right?
Absolutely. And this is why I think reform here at home is so critical to changing our approach abroad. And I think it actually relates to what Bridge was saying, which I just want to respond to really quickly, is I think actually the fundamental difference is that there has always been a belief that military solutions can fix political problems. And I think the post 9/11 wars prove that that is not the case, that you cannot fix people's sense of disenfranchisement, whether for political or economic reasons, and ability to be co-opted by extremist movements by the use of force. If anything, that just increases the influence of those groups, makes others less safe. And so we cannot have policies that respond to our own sense of insecurity by making others insecure. And to respond to your question, I think that it's absolutely, to me, one of the biggest security challenges that we face. And this is why I don't necessarily ascribe to, certain states are going to be our next big security challenges. It's much more about collective security problems. So climate change, nuclear weapons, misinformation, the corrupting influence of money. And I think, to go back to this other question as well, like, those are the corrupting influence of money in particular is what prevents us from making these changes. And on disinformation, this is why it is so critical that we take money from the military-industrial complex and we invest it in public education. And I think I was reading Hal's piece, and I thought it was interesting that we tend to agree on this. If you want to address the competition with China, if you want to address disinformation, it's actually about investing here at home. But we have to free up those resources from somewhere. We cannot be a global empire and then just let our own country and our institutions rot. And expect us to all remain safe and nothing to change, and there not to be foreign influence by competitors who see an opening, essentially. And so this is where, on your question about Elliott Abrams, I think accountability is so critical to this reformation as well, because we have, particularly in Washington, this revolving door of former officials who have acted badly, in his case, enabled genocide in Latin America. And there is no accountability for that. There was a pardon, and now we act like he is an actual advocate for democracy. And some want to believe that the Trump administration, because they say democracy and human rights about Venezuela, they're actually acting for democracy and human rights in Venezuela, not actual regime change, and for economic oil interests. And so it's a matter of actually saying what we mean and calling out and speaking truth to power, and then having institutions and mechanisms to actually foment accountability and provide justice for all. And so that's why in my piece for the post 9/11 wars, one thing that I advocate for is a truth commission. That would allow a public reckoning with what not only the United States have done, what our military partners have done, and how this global perpetual war has really distorted not only our threat inflation, but how we view the world and how we have really dehumanized others for the sake of quote unquote security.
So let me just, because this is important, you have a perfect right to have that view. It's not the view of CNAS or me personally that Elliott Abrams attempted genocide in Central America. That is an extremely severe charge. So I'd just like to, and I have very, very serious disagreements with Elliott Abrams, but just so everybody's clear about that. Last questions, let me get Phil Carter, and then you had a question as well, and then please be brief. We've got about 2 minutes, so.
Thanks, Bridge. Phil Carter, formerly of CNAS, and Kate, to follow up on that, you talk about in your paper and on the stage today accountability for the war in Afghanistan. You allude to war crimes. You've done so a couple of times. And I was wondering how you square that with all of the investigations, prosecutions, and records of accountability in Afghanistan. It seems that you are adopting sort of a guilty until proven innocent frame instead of looking at the existing rules and the existing systems like the Rome Treaty and its complementarity principle that allows for states to investigate their own actors. So I guess to be pointed, which rules do you care about, and which existing accountability systems would you use, or would you want to always create new ones like your Truth Commission?
Let me get last question here.
Justin Lynch, House Armed Services Committee. So it seems like whatever grand strategy we have, there has to be an accompanying vision that we can, or the political system can put out to the American people. Otherwise, elections or funding just won't exist that support the grand strategy we have, which we've seen a couple times in the past. So do you think that the visions you have, and I think, Kate, you absolutely seem to think this, but the visions that you have for your grand strategy and the vision that accompanies it is something that can capture the American population's imagination to the extent that that's important for that vision? Because there's some kind of inherently conservative views of the world or America's role in the world, and sometimes that can be hard to capture the imagination.
So we have about 1 minute. So Kate, Hal, Emma, please be extremely brief, and you can carry on conversations on Twitter or otherwise.
Just in terms of the rules, I think that the United States has undermined international accountability by not ratifying the Rome Statute, for example. I think there has been no reckoning with what private security contractors have done in Afghanistan, Iraq, other places, and then we continue to use them and outsource our use of military force abroad. And so I think it's looking at things like that, whether through domestic courts, international courts, and really on the front end, thinking about like, is this use of force, how we are doing this? Do we have proper rules to prevent civilian harm? What effect will that have on our military personnel? Because for everyone's talk of supporting our troops, we actually put them in a lot of positions that make them culpable when they shouldn't be.
I think there are some ambiguous and worrying signs about the American public's commitment to internationalism in general, but I actually think there's a fairly strong bipartisan consensus that the United States needs a more competitive stance vis-a-vis Russia, and there's an emerging consensus about the same thing with China. It's going to take effort to get there. So if you buy into the strategy that I propose, it's not going to come easily. But I'm actually less pessimistic about this than I would have been, say, 3 years ago.
You say ambiguous and worrying, I say encouraging. I think there are strong signs that the American people are actually ready for a more restrained grand strategy. Donald Trump is neither a restrainer nor very good at foreign policy, but the fact that he was willing to say during the election America shouldn't fight any more stupid wars, that was very popular. If you look at what's happening right now on the Democratic side of the aisle in the primary, the visions that are being presented for foreign policy are all much more narrowly scoped, and sometimes they do talk about the virtues and values that Kate is talking about, but they're all much more about dialing down our military presence overseas and talking about how to keep Americans safe and secure without overextending ourselves, and I find that very encouraging.
Great. Well, thanks all. I think we had a really stimulating panel. Before we thank them for their very, very interesting and illuminating comments, our next panel will be moderated by our president, Richard Fontaine, and it's on resetting the bar, where, how, and why America should or should not intervene abroad. So please join me in thanking the panelists.